BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Alright, hello everybody, and welcome to this special weekend episode of Black Box Online Radio. On the weekends, I've been doing a regular segment about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey from 1996. And before we truly begin, I would like to invite you to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It's a great way to help out all of these efforts. And of course, you can tune in during the week for the regularly scheduled lineup and look out for some shorter episodes that are going to be appearing here on Black Box Online Radio. As for the length of this episode, it's going to be a short one, but some of you guys know that I'm reading the book The Death of Innocence, which was authored by JonBenet's parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, and this book makes a claim that there is stunning DNA evidence that should have eliminated the Ramseys as suspects. Now, I'm going to have to do a larger episode on that in the future, but firstly, I wanted to read part of a chapter that is going to discuss that, and state that JonBenet Ramsey was murdered, as previously stated, in December of 1996. She was struck in the head with a blunt object, strangled with a garrote, and found inside her Colorado home. Now, some people believe that one of the family members in the house was responsible, either John Ramsey, the father, Patsy Ramsey, the mother, or Bert Ramsey, her brother. However, I just had to get straight to that chapter on the DNA. And it claims, again, from this book, The Death of Innocence, that the DNA of an unrelated individual was found underneath JonBenet's fingernails, suggesting that a different person was responsible for the crime. And at the point in the book where I am now, that's just kind of an open-ended idea. I was like, well, wait a second, what about this? What about that? Could that not have come from somewhere else? How long had it been there? I'm going to have to explore that in a future episode, as well as looking at some outside sources, because this book is called The Death of Innocence because it was written by JonBenet's parents, and the subtitle is JonBenet's Parents Tell Their Story. All right, they're giving their side of the story. They're trying not to be implicated in the murder of their own daughter. But because this is an episode on the psychological profile, I wanted to look at some statements that are shared in the book that are not written by the Ramseys, but by the FBI profiler John Douglas, who has been involved in other cases, even the Zodiac Killer mystery. Going to page 144 here in the book, I would like to look at a quotation from John Douglas about the murderer of JonBenet Ramsey. What struck me as really unusual is that the bedrooms, the family's mother and the father's bedrooms, were so far away on the third floor that even if you weren't a sound sleeper, you would have difficulty hearing any noise on the second floor because it is so far removed. I mean, that I don't think there's too much of a statement about that. I mean, saying that the parents have a bedroom on the third floor, JonBenet's bedroom was on the second floor, they wouldn't have heard an intruder. But another quote from John Douglas: generally, if a parent kills the child, they don't want to be the one to find the child. And famously, John Ramsey was the one who found JonBenet's body in the basement of their house. If they do search, say, in a residence, and yes, it is written like that, there actually is a space there. If they do search, say, in a residence, they'll get someone else to say, okay, you check this room, I'll be over here checking the other room. The other thing is you look at how the child was left. When the parents kill, they usually place the child in a very peaceful type of of way to look at it. They staged the crime scene, and that is a quotation, is a direct quotation from an episode of Dateline NBC where John Douglas was actually interviewed by Chris Hansen. Yes, Chris Hansen from To Catch a Predator. But the whole point is that he's saying that the evidence would not suggest that JonBenet had been murdered by one of the parents because of those previously stated reasons. That John Ramsey was the first one to find JonBenet's body, as well as, I can comprehend that. Like, just to give my honest take on the subject, I can comprehend if one of the parents had been responsible for the murder, then they would want somebody else to find the body so that they could feign ignorance and act like they had no idea where she was. But, we have to remember about profiling is that it is somewhat of an educated guess. And somebody did say that once, that a psychological profile really is just that, an educated guess. And then there is the second point of the body was normally left in a peaceful position, where JonBenet was not. Her arms were tied up over her head, and her body had actually stiffened after she had passed away, so that her arms couldn't even be moved to a lower position. And there's a big reenactment of this in the miniseries, Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, where John Ramsey finds JonBenet's body. It's very, very detailed, and he just says, oh, she's so stiff, and he can't move her arms down. But there's another quotation here that is not from John Douglas, but it's in the same chapter, and it refers to a comment that was made by a doctor from the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, and this person is Dr. Francesco Burf, and it says, I can tell you, as far as her medical history is concerned, there never was any hint whatsoever of sexual abuse. I didn't see any hint of emotional abuse or physical abuse. She was very much a love child, just as her brother, just a wonderful, happy kid who had the strength to deal with some very tough situations with regard to her mother's illness. And that, of course, is referring to Patsy Ramsey, who had ovarian cancer. Patsy Ramsey also passed away because of ovarian cancer. And I'm going to say something once again. This book, The Death of Innocence, is meant to be a persuasive piece so the parents can try and clear their name. But I'm sure some of you guys would have some immediate responses. I mean, firstly, to the people who actually think that the parents were responsible, we have to provide some counterbalance. And that is that, well, if someone's trying to stage the scene and make it look like an intruder or a kidnapper was responsible for the crime, then why on earth would they place her body in a peaceful position? I mean, I can comprehend what John Douglas is saying, that most of the time that's what happens, but not all of the time. I mean, the whole theory is that the scene would have been staged. And also, this thing about how John is the first person to find the body, again, putting on an act, putting on a facade. And also people who have sociopathic tendencies, and I'm not saying John Ramsey is, this is purely for the sake of discussion, people who have sociopathic tendencies will often try to put on an act and try and talk their way out of particular situations because they believe that they are very persuasive, they believe that they are very cunning, very smart, and they believe that they have the ability to fool people. Which side of the story do you agree with more? Do you agree with somebody such as John Douglas, or do you agree with the counterbalance? Do you believe that the evidence suggests that JonBenet was murdered by someone in the house, and if she had been murdered by somebody such as her brother Burke Ramsey, then almost certainly one of the parents would have been involved with staging the scene. But JonBenet was not only murdered, a ransom note was left behind, and the ransom note had a lot of information in it. It was 2.5 pages long. It said that it was written by a small foreign faction. There were at least 3 perpetrators involved. 2 men were watching over JonBenet, and John Ramsey had to provide them with $118,000 or she would have been beheaded. And if you'd like to hear a big discussion on that, I did a full episode called The JonBenet Ransom Note, full analysis, if you'd like to hear all of the observations that I have talked about, as well as looking at some other sources. And again, you can hit the like button and subscribe on this channel if you'd like to follow all of these true crime discussions, including talking about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and any subject under the sun or in the darkness for the Anything Goes Friday segment. But the final point that I would like to look at, that is shared by John Douglas via this book, The Death of Innocence, relates to the ransom note, and that is, this is a direct quotation again from Douglas. Leaving a handwritten document at the scene of the crime, in most cases, is tantamount to leaving one's calling card. Forensic document examiners say that it's nearly impossible for a person to disguise handwriting so that an expert can't link a suspect to a document, such as the note found in the Ramsey home. The older a person is, the more automatic and difficult it becomes to conceal the clues, and the longer the document is, the harder it becomes to disguise one's handwriting. And what I believe that the insinuation with that one is that Patsy Ramsey or John Ramsey wouldn't have written the ransom note because if they had, it would be an absolute definite connection that they would have been identified, they wouldn't have gotten away with it. And if you put all of John Douglas's pieces together, partnered with Dr. Francesco Burf saying that JonBenet was not abused, and that is just some type of misrepresentation, meaning that there was an outside perpetrator who was responsible for the crime, and that the way her body was left, the way that she was tied up, duct tape over her mouth, hands tied over her head, and not only struck in the head with a blunt object, but also strangled with the garrote. All of these things suggest someone who was not in her immediate family, and that this was someone who was unrelated to JonBenet. Now, that doesn't for a second mean it wasn't somebody who had familiarity with the house, familiarity with the Ramseys, familiarity with the location. No, familiarity is one thing. We're talking about direct family relations as well as nuclear family relations, father, mother, or brother. And on that note, on this channel, I rarely hold back what I genuinely think. And this next subject is going to be a little bit difficult to talk about, and I hope that it doesn't affect any specific person. But there is a section in the book, The Death of Innocence. It's actually begins on page 317. It talks about what's called the rumble on the internet. That's the name of the chapter. And about how so many people were using the internet in the early stages in the late 1990s to try and vilify the Ramseys, to try and vilify particularly John and Patsy Ramsey. And they even began referring to them as Borgs. And I was like, is that like a Star Trek thing? No, Borgs meaning BORG, bent on Ramsey guilt. And I was reminded of some of the newer discussions that are happening in the 21st century where people are focusing on the labels attributed to internet armchair detectives and true crime sleuths. Like there'll be some discussion groups where you have to take on a label. You have to be BDI, meaning Burke did it, PDI, Patsy did it, JDI, John did it, IDI, Intruder did it, and like you have to wear these things around like badges. And I think that that is just way too much of a clubhouse mentality, and it's almost as if people are just trying to form these little types of clubs on their own, and I think that that is an absolute distraction from the case. It is absolutely just trying to turn things into some sort of tribal mentality, and a tribal mentality should not exist when you're trying to solve a murder mystery. We should all be devoted to the facts, all devoted to analyzing pieces of information, and even if it isn't looking at something from the case file, trying to respond to books like this, The Death of Innocence, in an honest way. And my ultimate take on the comments that have been shared from the chapters that I've been reading here, particularly to John Douglas and Dr. Francesco Burf, is that it's a very compelling case. I mean, to those of you who have followed my episodes, you know that I believe that an outside individual was responsible for the murder of JonBenet, and I have never thought that the parents, John or Patsy Ramsey, or even Burke, had been responsible. And I mean, the DNA evidence that I discussed in the beginning, that's just a giant question mark for me. I mean, insufficient evidence, not enough information to make a ruling on that. I think everything in relation to what John Douglas has shared about the positioning of the body and John Ramsey finding JonBenet is comprehensible. It's not certifiable. Absolutely not. And as I said very clearly, I don't think John Ramsey murdered his daughter, but it's possible. And if I were presented with the end result and there was some type of enormous breakthrough in the case, and it's like John Ramsey was guilty, I was like, okay, I would. I mean, I have nothing to gain from saying that he's innocent if the facts support his guilt. But it appears that, yes, I think that that is a very consistent and coherent narrative, but it's only 90% there. There's still a very strong, 10% possibility that John Douglas's observations could be either completely incorrect or not relevant to the Ramseys directly. And as far as Dr. Francesco Burr stating that JonBenet was not abused, I mean, that is just going to be something that people are going to deny wholeheartedly. Some people just insist that that's the whole reason for the cover-up. But, I mean, there's the statement from a medical doctor all the same. And you can feel free to respond to anything in this episode the way you want. Write your ideas on the comments section down below, share some things, and if you know people who are curious about true crime cases and unsolved mysteries, feel free to share this episode on social media. Share it with your friends and family if you want to know their take on the subject. I would love to read your messages in the comments section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there is always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.